news or bad news, pero andito na tayo. This will not be a very formal lecture, gaya ng nakasanayan. Some of the participants were asking kung academic lecture ba ito. It's actually very far from that. I wanted it to be very practical and very comprehensive. I'm trying my best to compress a week's worth of session into one webinar. But thank you for taking the time this weekend, which is supposed to be time spent with your families and friends, to join us for a short session on communication planning and crisis communications. Medyo malawak itong area of discussion natin, but I'll try as much as I can to introduce everyone to the work that we do at the Public Affairs Service, and most importantly, what you can possibly adopt in your own division and regional offices. So ayun na nga, I think you saw a video early on, no? Umasa tayong lahat sa prediction ni Master Hans, at ang lucky year daw ng 2020. Maganda raw mag-open ng business at lahat ng kondisyon ay favorable sa prosperity. But the world has changed a few degrees when we had the Taal volcano eruption, kakaumpisa ng taon. Sabi ko nga nakakalungkot din na naghiwalay si James Reid at Nadine Lustre. Baka dahil doon, kaya nagkaroon ng COVID, everything turned upside down. Siguro ang solusyon lang sa COVID ay pagbalikin ang love team na yan para matapos na to. But kidding aside, 2020 has indeed become one of the most unpredictable year for everyone, most especially in the Department of Education. And the Secretary has been mentioning repeatedly over the past few weeks that communication at this very critical time is quite important. In fact, information has always been a prime commodity, but at this point, it has become the only currency. These are very challenging times indeed, and the normal ways have become abnormal, or sabi nga sa jargon, new normal. So just a preview of what we are going to discuss today. We will talk briefly about the communication arms of the communication arm, I should say, of the Department of Education, the Public Affairs Service. I will present the current situation on the ground through a Gallup environment scan and analysis. We will also look at our stakeholders, define our communication objectives. Equally important and top of mind now is how do we frame our key messages. I also added a brief understanding about the psychology of crisis and why it's very important to consider this in relation to education. I will introduce the IACP approach, a very handy advice for interviews and statements. This is something that you cannot browse on the internet or read in books. No? Wala pa siyang academic paper. But it's very present in the current public relation interventions, which you will see later on. But most interesting of all, I think, will be the section where we talk about crisis communication and why we are shifting gears in the Department of Education. So just a brief backgrounder, the Public Affairs Service, for those who are not aware as of yet, is the communication arm of the Department of Education. As you can see, there's a lengthy bureaucratic narrative in front of you, but there are only a few things we need to remember. It consists of the Communications Division and the Publications Division, although in the long term, our plan is to expand it to include two more divisions, the Public Assistance Division and the Creative Media Division. These are existing, but they're only units so far. But the main task of PAS is to create the National Communications Framework in order to guide DepEd personnel in the conduct of their communication efforts. That is equally important for the central office when interfacing with national media, and of utmost importance to the field offices who are communicating with their grassroots publics. No? And we're in the process of finalizing it. It's 2020 because 2020. So even if 2020 is very unlucky for some, 2020 talks about clear vision. Once we're done, we will be one of the first national agencies to have a national communications framework. And this is very important now, especially during this very precarious time. We have to align all our efforts and direct it towards synchronized communication goals. So here's the org chart. just to give everyone an idea how PAS fits in the organizational structure of the department. We are under the Office of the Secretary, under Chief of Staff Yusek Tepo Malaluan. The Public Affairs Service leadership serves and can only work under the trust and confidence of the Executive Committee and the Secretary. Communications is a very delicate and precarious situation to be in. We try as much as possible to be proactive and respond soonest to issues on the ground. You can also see from the org chart that we have a shadow unit. We call it the Past Crisis Unit. It's not in the organizational documents, but we have convened the core group since the Taal volcano eruption. Later on, I will explain why it's important to have that kind of unit within the organization. So where do we release information and communicate? We have the website, of course, and there are plans to revamp that and create a website policy. We also post in Workplace, and I think some of you are there already. We have the Public Assistance Center where we receive emails, calls, SMS, and messages on Facebook. And the ever famous walk-in when you have the most angry clients coming in sa DepEd Central Office. And we have groups for the media as well, and we plan to revive the DepEd Press Corps. I think some of you might have noticed that some changes were creeping in back in January. There was a rebranding of the DepEd Facebook page. A YouTube account has also been created, and we endeavor to populate that as soon as we can. And we now have an Instagram account. And funnily enough, we have a verified DepEd TikTok account. Wala pa ako nako-convince na mag-TikTok sa DepEd at gustong mawala ng dangal at dignidad overnight kasi sayang naman yung account. But seriously, we will soon populate that as well with education materials. And kung may mag-volunteer at may magandang idea, we're very open to collaborate. But our primary social media channel is definitely Facebook. And most of our followers are actually middle-aged women from urban areas, surprisingly. They say Facebook is the most emotional social media platform. Twitter is more tame compared to it, and it reflects the Filipino sensibility of the value of social connection. And yes, proud to be Pinoy tayo kasi number one pa rin tayo sa Facebook usage sa buong mundo sa awa ng Diyos. This is a very interesting time because some young communication practitioners would insist on spending so much resources and time on Snapchat or even Tumblr and even Twitter, no? But Facebook's followership is more than double that of Twitter. The only time I really worry about Twitter is when I see the same sentiment being carried on Facebook, like some recent events. Twitter is a very good way to release information, but Facebook is still the queen by a long mile. The message is simple. We have to take Facebook and YouTube seriously. For those divisions with no YouTube account, maybe it's time that we rethink about it. Because almost 80% of our social media users nowadays actually spend 3 to 4 hours a day currently on social media. And a lot of our teachers and our parents, not to mention our learners, are online during this pandemic. I think it's pretty obvious at this point how valuable social media is in our communication efforts. So I think that the question is, why do people go on social media? You have to remember that this study was done during the pandemic. Majority say that they are there for news and information, communication with family and friends, and to share news and information, and of course, entertainment. Remember those keywords, no? Information, communication, and entertainment. So our social media site should be able to do those three key things. No? Because only when we can provide information and entertainment value can we engage and educate our users. The most common misconception is that you upload an education video or post and it will fly off. We have to remember the attention span of people nowadays has been dramatically reduced. Most of us, I think, remember a time when advertisements are designed to last for 15 or 30 seconds. Nowadays, we have an ever narrowing window of 3 to 5 seconds only. Let me repeat that. 3 to 5 seconds. Either they get interested or they scroll down. That's the very slim window of opportunity when we have the chance to catch our audiences. So there's a huge demand to make our posts not only informative and educational, but also entertaining. Because I think we go back to the philosophical paradox now. If a tree falls in the forest, will it make a sound? Translating it for online, if a post is not seen nor shared by a great number of people, did it have any value at all? And the most important thing to look at, and I know most of us love the likes and the hearts and yung bago yung care on Facebook. But the true measure of success, however, is when it gets shared. So let me repeat that, no? Likes do not make any post viral. It's the organic shares that will completely and ultimately define success. Because when you share something, you will be able to multiply the mileage even more than liking it. So when you post something like 500 shares, it's actually better than 1,500 likes. But reach is also an important figure to see, no? Yung reach natin. How many people were given the opportunity to see your post? So what we do at PAS as well is we look at the analytics of each post, each month, week, and year. And here's a rundown, no, of 2017 to March 2020, just at the beginning of the pandemic. We have exceeded our average reach in the past 3 years. From the high of 72 million reach last year, we have almost doubled that in a matter of 3 months to 123 million, and exceeded the engagement of the past 3 years. And there's a reason for that. I'll explain later on. The point here is that if you maintain your social media pages, please track your progress. This is very relevant sa mga information officers. Because data is everything. Data is king, no? If your performance online is lower than the previous stats you got, now it's time to re-strategize siguro. We don't just maintain accounts. I hate the word maintain actually. Rather, we improve and push forward. The only way is up, ika nga. So remember, social media is very critical during this pandemic, and we have to go back to the time spent by people, which is like 3 to 4 hours a day, and that's like half a day of work just browsing social media. So at some point, we must be able to attract the attention of our audiences. Again, let me reiterate, before we can educate, we need to entertain and connect and communicate as well. But it's not only social media we're tracking. We're also looking at the reach and advertisement or PR value of the news that comes out. Note here, no, it's not the frequency that matters. It's really the reach and the mileage. So we have a software which we use. It's called Media Meter. So anything that has teacher, DepEd, or Secretary Briones, or DepEd Commons, even on it, we will be able to track that. We also see your local news from the divisions and regional offices. Even the Bisaya versions of it, no? Pag minimension ng DepEd, hagip agad. And there is a group where your USEX and even the secretary herself can see all the news in a day as they break into the mainstream media. At this time of crisis, we have extended our monitoring from pre-COVID, which is 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Why is that? It's because monitoring the news and even social media is quite important. Ang old school style niyan, if you don't have media meter, is this. When I was working in politics, I usually look at the front page of all newspapers and listen to primetime radio in the morning and watch only 2 TV shows, yung TV Patrol and 24 Oras. Because you can see the agenda right away. So every morning, what I do is I text my principal by 7:30 a.m. ano ang balita at ano ang potential sasabog sa araw na ito. So monitor the news which comes out. Make it a daily habit beginning from now on if you haven't started. But I also have an advice. if the news came from major media and primetime TV and primetime radio in the morning, please consider them as very important. No? And talk to your communications officer and gather advice if it needs a response. Because sometimes there's a tendency for us to jump when a negative news comes out. Uh, but for me personally, the rule of thumb is you have to ask yourself, one, is it from a major media channel? Um, Two, is it gaining traction online? Is it prime time? Is there a potential that it might be the agenda in the next few days? Is media going to follow up? Then if you answer those questions, it's a good advice to respond. But again, this is not science. Napakahalaga ng gut feel sa communication officer. An information or communication officer is there not to give the news as they are, but to evaluate what is important and critical. I think more than relaying the news, a communication officer must be able to recommend a course of action for executives, for our supervisors and RDs, for example. This is where we see the value of information. This is the 24/7 news cycle. Just about 2 decades ago, we have the 12-hour news cycle. Now, because of social media, we have an entire day where any news can come out. For some, they see it as a very difficult work to really scan everything. But the good news is when something breaks, or surely something else and something fresh is coming to continue the cycle. So another important question to ask, yes, pumutok yung sa media yung storya, no? Yes, prime time. Pero what are the other news outlets, no? Considering the issues who are discussing the same issue in the media? That's a very important question to ask because akala natin minsan nakafocus sa atin ang spotlight, no? Ramdam na ramdam natin yung init ng mundo. But the reality is, mas maraming kulay at mas malaki yung spotlight ng 10 katabi mo at nandoon yung atensyon ng tao. Again, that's something to consider. I'm not suggesting that we ignore the news. Ang sinasabi ko is we work with our communication officers and get advice because they are and should be trained to evaluate media reports. It is still the best position to have all the information you need. There's no such thing as information overload, no? But there is something which we call as information myopia, where we don't see which news is worth responding and attending to. But looking at the top of the table, you notice nire-report ng media sa DepEd mostly school calendar, yung mga issues recently, online classes, concern of private school teachers. Those three are top of mind as well, at least according to traditional media. So the first indicator is social media. We talked about that. Our data goes into scanning of traditional media and determining PR value. But we don't stop there. Remember earlier I mentioned that we receive messages on Facebook and through the Public Assistance Center. So these are collated and studied as well. And you notice the similarities, no? School calendar pa rin, online classes. I have to remind you though that this data is around late April. In science high school voucher inquiries, learning modules, teacher subsidy for private schools. Until now, mainit-init pa yan. Graduation and homeschooling options. So we can also compare that with the issues of previous years. And we see a pattern. So every day, we scour our social media as well as the most shared and top issues. But we look at the comment section as well and check what is repeated over and over again. So this is not totally scientific data gathering, but we see the repeated issues of a lot of parents. The more angry, the better. Why? Because an angry man tells the truth. So yung mga pinaka-angry, yun ang ini-scan namin. Well, at least most of the time, no? Ewan ko kung nadidepress na yung mga tiga-check ng social media at na-heart attack na sa dami ng negative reactions. But take a closer look. Health and safety of their kids is our primary, no? They want to postpone schools to 2021. There's issue on accessibility and challenges of online education. They're worried about tuition fee increases. This is important, no? Parents are asking time to recover financially. If you also notice, we try as much as we can not to publicize schools as quarantine areas because parents are worried, and rightly so. And of course, we see the top concerns of our teachers as well. They feel they are not trained to do online teaching, and some lack gadgets. Considerations for teachers who are at risk. They are asking about their safety and well-being. Those are top of mind. The good news is a lot is being prepared, no, at the central office to address some of these concerns, and the LCP and a lot of orders and clarifications will come out soonest. And we will be able to start to answer all of these concerns. So, maraming galit sa DepEd because there's a lack of information. Ang masakit yung magulang at mga gurus mismo ang nagagalit. So that calls for a serious and long-term intervention in the long haul. Right now, PAS, with the help of central office directors, are drafting the FAQs. We will upload that sa website very, very soon. And I am also constantly in touch with some of our field communicators to check issues on the ground as well. So, faced with all this data that is mined from all over, how do we see communications under the new normal? One, we need to have heightened activity in social and digital media spaces. Right now, I'm negotiating with Google, Facebook, TikTok, Canva, and other providers to help the DepEd efforts in social media. So, talk must be the walk. It's also important to provide credible, transparent, and reliable information. But moving on, so the first step we did, nag-environment scanning tayo, we gathered data, we saw what was happening. The next step is to look at your stakeholders. We focus on those who are most hostile, sabi ko kanina. After this, we will complete this cycle at the end of the session. So from environment scanning to stakeholder mapping, we formulate communication objective. Ano ba ang gusto nating sabihin? So once we have a message, we strategize and we create tactics. And lastly, we go to the monitoring and evaluation part. So this cycle is not true only in times of pandemic, but very useful in our day-to-day communication needs. I would suggest that you adopt this for your local needs. There are also a lot of risks and challenges, no, that we have to consider. I think this was presented by Yusek Nepo to Congress. No? This is internal naman sa atin sa DepEd, looking into us as DepEd leaders and decision makers. No? So there's a downside and upside of any new and massive undertaking, kumbaga. One, mas expert po kayong lahat dito. Distance learning will reinforce teaching and learning approaches, which we know do not work well. Educators will be overwhelmed if you proceed with education. The protection and safety of our children will be harder to safeguard in this pandemic. School closures will widen the equity gap. And this is very relevant. No? Poor experience with the use of education technology will make it harder to buy in later if we convince users to use education technology. So we have our own internal challenges as an institution during this pandemic. But learning delivery and modalities are being prepared, but this will recur over time as long as we are in crisis mode. So we take a closer look now at our stakeholder map. This tells us prioritization of communication efforts to a stakeholder. So we define our stakeholders based on the level of influence and relationship to DepEd. So what do we need to do? No? We need to observe and monitor our learners, the regular hostile groups, and the general public. Notice that there are two teachers on the diagram and two parents. We have to balance our communication with our teachers and parents on a normal day. But at this time, and it seems pretty obvious to all of us, in this crisis situation, we need to take time to educate and cultivate constant communication with them now more than ever. Higher up, we need to activate and amplify our messaging to media, government agencies, and other potential allies and stakeholders. Notice also that we need to focus on local government units, our private sectors, our civil society. Why? Because some of the negative information that comes out emanates from those sectors. So the quick solution is unahan na natin ito and keep them informed and educated with the latest developments in the Department of Education. Some of our executive committee members are doing that. Those are the things which are not obvious on the media, but there are a lot of groups and stakeholders they are actually talking to. Now, this stakeholder map can be broken down into so many elements, but this is just a start. And it gives us perspective on what we need to do and how to strategize our communication efforts. So as you can see, this is just a summary of the stakeholder mapping which we did. Can we see the sample, Zoe? Okay. So parents, no, our PTAs, we need to activate them to become later on advocates of the LCP. At this point, realistically, you cannot do that. I'll explain later. Their level of influence is very high, and in this session, we need to identify opportunities of communication. Also, important, again, our local government units. So, minsan, ang problema is tayo lang nakakaalam ng kwento natin. Well and good. But we have to be worried, no? Yung kliyente natin, uhaw din pala sa information. This is not complete as of yet, and we're refining it. I disagree with some recommendations here, but the communication objectives are very clear. No, number one, we need to increase awareness of DepEd efforts on health and safety and well-being. We need to generate engagement and support from education stakeholders, our allies and potential allies. Will be of great help in this struggle to maintain DepEd's institutional integrity. We need to ensure timely and accurate response to the new normal concerns. These are the policy directives, FAQs, guidelines, etc., etc. And we have to maximize each communication opportunity and channel at our disposal. Recently, we have created a collaboration with Central Office DepEd pages. When we release the National Communications Framework as well, you will see the guiding principle for all of this stuff. No, the NCF mainly talks about the idea that every stakeholder is a communicator. So, can you see the draft NCF diagram? Hello, Zoe. Naka-flash na ba yung NCF diagram? I don't see it on my end.
Hindi pa magkikita.
Hindi makita.
Yeah. Zoe, can we flash that first? Okay. There you go. So can you see it now? That's the draft process flow of the National Communications Framework. We often see the traditional communication model taught to us in schools where we are taught that there's a sender, a message, a channel, a receiver. In the Public Affairs Service and in the Draft National Communications Framework, there's a little distinction between the sender and the receiver. My assumption when I was formulating this communication model is that everyone is a sender and the receiver at the same time. So everyone in DepEd and our external stakeholders are communicators for DepEd and for education. Because we have to realize that the most difficult and the most powerful enemy in the age of social media is word of mouth. People relate to their peers. We tend to believe what our friends say more than a stranger who trumpets a message we find hard to relate to, no recognize. No? So, awareness, engagement, response for our stakeholders, 4 keywords. Zoe, next. Next part dun sa, you go to, there you go, communication objectives. So awareness, engagement, response for our stakeholders, 4 keywords. No? What for? Health and safety is our primary consideration. External support is needed. Accuracy and timelines are important. And whatever assets we have, we need to maximize. Before we go to the key messages, I added something which puts some random ideas on framing our messages. How do we understand the bigger picture in our communication objectives? So how do we see and contextualize our messages? So the international frame, you have to say and remind in your statement that COVID-19 is not a problem of DepEd, nor the country alone. It's a worldwide pandemic. You have to contextualize it. No? National context. The Learning Continuity Plan is approved by the IATF and Malacanang. Mention that. Hindi ito kagustuhan lamang ng DepEd. Put a support and a band around that statement. And you localize further. No? In the long game, our efforts will require concerted efforts from our public, specifically our LGUs, etc., etc. Di ko alam yung number 4, 5, 6, 7. But anyways, in framing, you have to remember that communication is the art of negotiation. You will understand this deeper as we go along. We are in the process of negotiating. We are not simply communicating. I have mentioned to some of our EXICOM members that, in fact, my take right now is later we have to move beyond communications. No? This is a public relations battle, more specifically. We need to maintain our legitimacy with our key publics, and there has to be mutuality and mutual benefits in the relationship. No? Crisis is also the worst time for a news blackout. So when a crisis hits, if you have an accurate information, you have to constantly update your public, constant and accurate. Why? Because if you don't provide information, firstly, your audience and your publics will seek information from somewhere else. And that information, unfortunately, will be something that is beyond your control. Another handy and useful tip, when you say anything, use the pronouns we, us, tayo, atin, natin. As much as you can when referring to the institution. You have to communicate that the institution is one and united. I dislike yung phrase na ginagamit palagi, kami sa DepEd. Kami sa DepEd. No? It puts you on a separate plane. So you have to phrase your sentences using these words in the vernacular. They are valuable to DepEd, and they are part of our plan, and we are planning with them. So to distinguish at this point in time is actually to alienate. No? The graphic notes below are for social media managers. If someone will ask about this later on, I can answer and go into detail. But let's skip to the meaty part. So we know our objectives. We have a general sense of how to frame our conversation and declarations. It is time we look at our key messages. Later on, I'll tell you why this is important. More than highlighting an issue, our perspective, it will be very, very handy, I think. This is for the next few weeks or the next few days even. This comms plan pala is not set in stone. This is not a constitution. It's a guidance. No? The message house will change accordingly depending on the specific purpose of the communication effort and incident. Just a caveat for everyone. Again, the communications plan is a living document. So it changes in response to developments on the ground. The most common mistake kasi minsan is pag may communication plan na tayo, we follow to the dot and to the apostrophe. Okay? It's not a legal document. Considering that communication and public emotional temperature are always volatile and the comms plan also adjusts accordingly. I know this is frustrating for some of our information officers because nasulat mo na pero pag may sumabog na balita or sa panahon ng crisis, no, nagbabago siya every minute. So, what's our main message? I have to remind you as well that this was made for Oplan Balik Eskwela and Brigada Eskwela specifically. So, one, understanding the fears and apprehension of our people and key publics due to the pandemic, we will initiate bayanihan sa paaralan, to prompt unified actions from our stakeholders in the safe delivery of education. That's where we anchor all our key messages below. But that's the main meat that we have to remember. We need to communicate the prioritization of the health and safety and well-being of parents and our teachers and our learners. We will ensure the required health standards. So I also propose pala not to use the phrase minimum health standards. It should be required health standards by the WHO, DOH, and IATF. Okay? Tapos ngiti tayo ng konti pag nasabi na natin yan. So dito sa part na to, ilalagay yung mga programs ng DepEd for health and safety like hand washing, PPE, psychosocial intervention, face-to-face, online issues, yung mga ganong mga taxonomy ng communication issues natin. So we often say education must continue, no? So we also did a quick environment scan of that, and we propose to rephrase that to readiness of education opportunities. So I would like to discourage, this is just my recommendation, do not use education must continue. Use readiness of education opportunities. The message is that learning opportunity will be available. We are not being pushy nor dogmatic. No? We have a hidden message. Kung baka sinasabi mo, mga kapatid, hindi namin pinupush at inoobliga na dalhin ninyo ang mga anak nyo sa eskwelahan. But there's a nice way of saying it. Meron tayong handang learning opportunities para sa ating mga mag-aaral. Then smile. Okay? So dito na yung curriculum and instruction, ang LCP, face-to-face, and other online issues. So ito inuulit ko, engagement of stakeholders. Hindi lamang ang DepEd ang magsisigurado ng oportunidad at karapatan ng mga batang magkaroon ng edukasyon. Kasama namin ang mga magulang, kayo, ang media, kayo ang aming kasama, mga mayor, kapitan, ng ating buong pamayanan para sa adhikaing ito. Our failure will not be ours alone because it takes a nation to raise a child. Then smile. Okay? So, experts and scientists were consulted. Nakalagay dito sa key message na to. Epidemiological studies, nakalagay dyan. Yung brigada, yung issue ng parents' anxieties. Okay? Pang-apat, handa kaming tumugon at kakailanganin namin ang tulong ninyo. So magiging bukas ang DepEd at sisikapin namin panatilihing bigyan ng atensyon lahat ng mga problema. Dahil mission namin ang tumugon palagi kasama kayo. Smile. Okay? So dyan yung Oplan Balik Eskwela, public assistance, yung needs, yung welfare ng teachers, yung salaries, yung PBBs, everything. It falls into the key message. Okay? Again, we go back sa framing, no? Synchronized national effort. Ang DepEd ay patuloy na nakikipag-ugnayan sa lahat ng sangay ng gobyerno at susundin natin ng maigi ang patakaran ng IATF dahil ang misyong ito ay bahagi ng malawakang paghahanda ng gobyerno para sa inyo at sa inyong mga anak. Or para sa atin at sa ating mga anak, sorry. Pagkakaisa, yung message ng pagkakaisa, message ng bayanihan. Then smile. Okay? So narinig ko na yung halaklak ng iba dyan. So there's a hidden mnemonic device, actually, if you notice. No? So remember, U, understanding and unity. P, priority and health, ang health and safety. Ready, pagkahanda. Engagement, magkakasama. Strengthen, tapalakasin ang pagtugon. Synchronized national effort. UPRESS. UPRESS. Alright? So kasama ang DepEd sa malawakang pagkilos. But again, be very careful tayo. Baka sa press conference, sasagot tayo ayon sa key message number 1 ng Public Affairs Service. Wag po natin gagawin iyon. So better to take it to heart rather than memorizing it. Dahil ma-heart attack ako, no, pag nabalitaan kong may sumagot ng ganun sa media. I will have failed as a communications person. So you can adopt this. You can improve, you can localize. Mas maganda pag sa vernacular siya. And this is not a prescriptive message house. It's up to you to build on and create one for your own use. But you get the feel of what we're going to say sa taas. I will not upload this presentation. This is not a public document. So what can we do to communicate all of this? I only know of what we do sa central office most of the time. But you can rethink what is practical and possible sa local divisions po ninyo. And right now we have bi-monthly press briefing, but actually everyday interviews yan. Pagod na sa kakulitan namin sina Yusek Ann, Yusek Nepo, at ngayon damay-damay na sina Yusek Alain, Yusek Dads, Yusek Repsi. Dahil araw-araw kaming nag-iikot, makasingit sa schedule nila para may spokesperson palagi tayo sa media. Stress na sila kasi hinaharas namin sa past. So, it's also important, itong synergy with other DepEd online allies. Remember, I mentioned that everyone is a communicator and we must coordinate. So, we are very thankful to our DepEd Central Office bureaus na nakikipag-bolt in sa amin at rumirescue palagi. Yung DepEd tayo is also on board from the beginning, Our RIOs and DIOs na nakukulitan na rin pag naghahanap kami ng kwento na ilalabas sa araw-araw. But it is important to really tell our side of the story. So right now, I'm working with UNICEF to develop a much bigger communications plan. This is just very simple. Google is on board, Facebook, sabi ko kanina. One thing I learned in DepEd in the past 5 months na nandito ako is maraming nagmamahal sa sektor ng education. So, ang daming gustong tumulong. May mga fora na ginagawa sa engagement, dialogue sa mga NGOs and other stakeholders na ginagawa ng Office of the Secretary. Those are very, very helpful and making our job easier sa past. And I think lastly, led by PAAC, we aim to constantly open all available lines of communication. We don't want to be isolated as an institution. We have to listen to everyone. Although it takes a lot of time and patience, it's the only way we can create a better and improved, I think, communication plan. So why are we discussing these key messages? Because these are important to remember when you are ambushed by the media or you are in a press conference, especially most of the people who are here are DepEd executives. So when a question is asked, you answer, but you always go back to the relevant key message and you emphasize it. Remember, the media has a story they wanted to tell, most often. That's a reality. But you stick to your key messages. Remember, ang kailangan ng TV, ang kailangan ng TV ay 15-second clip mo lang. Okay? Don't talk for 3 or 5 hours. Don't talk so long and too much. You can do that sa radio because that's audio, But remember the headline. Give them the headline. Go back to your key messages. So kahit paikot-ikot yan na tanong na sasagutin natin, napakahalaga to have your own key messages handy and connect with the issues at hand. So the algorithm is very simple. Question, answer, key message number 1. May iba namang question, answer, anong pwedeng key message? Pwede yung key message number 2, i-reiterate ko lang siya ng konti. But you have to answer the question. Don't evade it, okay? But you go back to your key messages. Basta pabalik-balik ka lang doon. So it takes skill and practice, but you'll get used to it, Ilang paalala lamang sa presser or sa presscon. Check what we call as emotional temperature. Yung emotional temperature, if people, our publics are anxious and angry, we need to acknowledge their sentiments and we need to empathize. This is true in real life and very true indeed in any public pronouncements. Empathize, not sympathize. So I'm going to show you a short video on the difference of empathy and sympathy. Let's try natin kung mag-play siya. Okay? Take it away, babe. Can you see it? Nakita niyo ba?
And why is it? Hindi po.
So can you please
Hindi po nakita.
We can see the video that
We can see the video
Hindi po. Correct.
Yung video po hindi nagpi-play.
Okay, so let's try again. Let's wait for Zoe to.
ito. Tara.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an 80 student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay. I think that's very, very clear now. So whatever facts you have, it's very important to have a spokesperson who can connect with the audience. A good way to exercise empathy is to listen and develop a narrative. No? Our minds kasi are wired to understand stories. Kaya usong-uso ang Disney. So, 3 little things which people can remember about you and your issues. The average reasonable person remembers the Holy Trinity, the 3 Musketeers, and the 3 Little Pigs within 30 seconds of hearing you or looking at you. So going back to the presser, when talking, change your intonation, falling to writing. As much as possible, be lively, but don't get carried away. You emphasize the words, say them with conviction. Make it personal. If you are a debted employee and a parent, no, and you discuss the anxieties of other parents, it helps if you share the same similar experience they have. But don't give too much information. Okay, you focus on the key messages. So vision is also, I think, very important in a crisis. I'm not talking about, sorry, na-turn off ata yung video. I'm not talking about the mission vision, no, that we see painted on our walls. So ano ba yung long-term plan mo as the executive on top of this crisis? When we can clearly portray a future for other people who feel like they don't have one. This is a difficult job, no? But there are a lot of good leaders who can inspire people with vision. So you need to cultivate engagement. So sa dami ng sinasabi mo sa press con, ano ang dapat nilang gawin? What's in it for them, di ba? And what do you need from them? So from your key public. So don't demand, invite and offer. So you have to also define the issue. So may teacher na nagre-report, wala pa siyang sweldo, no? How do you define? Frame. Actually, 98% ng ating mga empleyado ay nakasweldo na. So don't attack and say, hindi totoo yan. And then you become hostile right away. No? That's our tendency minsan when we are faced with a fact that's very uncomfortable. So, na-define mo yung issues and what are you going to do about it? How will you act on it? You have to ensure that the action you're talking about is doable and can be done soonest and very, very clear. Most importantly, you go back to the key messages and you close the gap. One last time, connect with your audience and close the gap. So some of you might be thinking, Sir Jun, paano yan in real life? So you want to see how these 11 things that I mentioned work? Let's watch a very short video. This was Prime Minister after the terrorist attack in New Zealand last year. She was talking to children in school. I want you to observe her language and her emotion. Play with us, Zoe.
For one of you right now, just as much as me, will want to do nothing more than to ensure that people feel safe. And they feel like they can practice their religion no matter what it is, no matter what their background. And this is where I have something I can ask of you. Feeling safe means feeling free from violence, and there's lots of things that government can do to make sure people are free from violence, and we will do those things. But it also means making a place where there's no environment for violence to flourish. Or we don't let racism exist. Because racism breeds extremism, breeds some of the things that we unfortunately have had visited upon New Zealand. And so this is my request. I alone cannot get rid of those things by myself. I need help from every single one of us. And so if we want to feel like we are doing something to make a difference, yes, show those outpourings of love, gather together, send that strong message, look after one another. But also, let New Zealand be a place where there is no tolerance for racism, ever. And that's something we can all do. We have a challenge in front of us. That social media can be a place where we can do good. Who heard about the gathering at Hagley Park through social media? And so it was a tool to help bring people together to send a message of love and support, but it can also be a place where messages of hate and division are spread. Now there's things that we need to do to confront that. I want you to know we're going to try and do that, and we'll probably try and do that alongside some of our international friends. But in the meantime, we need you to help us guard against that too.
Okay, so I think we have to go back now. So dun sa so don't say it's difficult now. If it can be said and done in a few seconds. So yun yung example ko. So ina-apply lahat yun ng yung sinabi ko. So let me also show you a sample press briefer. No? This was actually prepared for one of the press conferences before. So what PAS does is we give it kay Yusek Nepo, and then pag in-okay na niya,